Andrew Ley, L-E-Y. I was a 63 at Belmont High, known as Andy then. Got to college, my roommate said, that's too hokey, Drew's better, so Andrew is a multi-purpose name, which is the full name. So.
And which branch of the military did you serve?
Marines. Freshman year at college, I said, what am I going to do when I graduate? And a fellow that later became a fraternity brother, he was in Navy ROTC at Dartmouth, and I said, well, that seems like a good idea. This was 1963. Things were quiet in the Far East, sort of. By the time I graduated in '67, it was a whole different ballgame. So I said, well, okay, here I am in the Marines, so away we go. Well, the fellow I just mentioned, he was a scholarship Navy ROTC person. And I said, well, it seems like a good idea. I ended up not on a Navy scholarship, but as a contract person, which only obligated you at that point to 3 years active duty. This is 1963. Taking the Navy ROTC courses at Dartmouth, we had this really hokey Navy instructor, and he was just, yeah. But by the same token, there was this very dynamic Marine instructor, and he'd spent 12 years in China. He had all these stories about the CIA, you know, it was just charismatic. And I said, okay, we're all going to go. This other fella and another couple other people, we all said, we're going to switch to Marine option. So sophomore year, made the election to go into the Marine option as part of the Navy ROTC. And that's how it happened. Just typically personalities, you know, can drive you one way or the other. So. Oh yes, well, I always wanted to sort of fly, and the Navy would give you flight lessons while you were in college. So I remember we're in Hanover, New Hampshire, so I would take these flight lessons like in February. It was 20 degrees or something like that in this funky little airplane. And once I got commissioned, went to Quantico and then to flight school, which is a year and a half of specialized training. Yes, there was a lot of specialized training. As a ROTC student, you had your junior year, summer, went down to Quantico for OCS. That was a 10-week program. And since a lot of the people were Ivy League, whatever, students at OCS, the instructors, I remember Staff Sergeant Diaz was our sergeant instructor in our OCS platoon. But he would sort of make you realize this is a little different world than being in ROTC on a campus. So you ended up, you know, getting to some degree shoved in your head conformity, things like that. And a lot of it is, which was interesting from the OCS perspective, is the psychological side. One, they're trying to have you end up with some conformity, and also how do you adapt and react to adverse situations. Like, it wasn't unusual to have them take a bucket of sand and throw it, or a 55-gallon drum of sand, throw it all over the squad bay, and then give you half an hour for everyone to clean it up. So everyone had to work together to get it done, because you knew you were going to be inspected within 45 minutes. And if they found any sand, blah, 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 then everybody suffered. You go out and do laps, whatever the, the thing was. So everyone had to kind of get together and work towards a common goal. By the same token, they would also rotate individuals as sort of the leader for the week or the day or whatever. And it was, it was sort of a leadership, I don't want to say test, but to get you into the mode of, okay, you are now in charge, get these guys, and they're all guys then, to do this or that or whatever. And you get graded on how well you accomplish that task. I could tell one funny story though. At OCS, we had a field exercise, and we had M14s then, and we were out in the exercise. Remember, this is OCS, so you're still being yelled at by various folks. And the M14 for the field exercises had blank adapters in the front because the M14 needed a little blowback to recharge. It was a semi-automatic weapon. And at one point, the extractor in the bolt had jammed, and it wouldn't get the spent round casing out of the rifle. So I took it to one of the sergeants who said, "Oh, we can go fix this." And he takes his K-bar out, a knife, and fusses around with it. And there's a little tiny, highly compressed spring in the bolt. And he's going like this, and ding! This little highly compressed spring goes out into the leaves, you know, and we spent a couple hours looking for it. Well, okay. That thereby rendered the rifle sort of inoperable. All right, race back to the barracks, rifle inspection in 10 minutes, and I had this bolt that was all apart because the spring had gone. So we're out there, clean the rifle real quick, and there's the whole platoon there at attention, and this Staff Sergeant Diaz, as I mentioned, came along, and he takes everyone's rifle and he looks at it to make sure it's all clean and stuff like that, and hands it back to you. And he gets to me, and when you present the weapon, you slide the bolt back so he can go, and it's all very formalistic the way this happens. Well, he gets to me, and I'm holding the weapon, and he takes the weapon, but he notices I didn't pull the bolt back because there was no bolt in there. Well, this sort of flummoxed him because he's going, wait a minute, what happened? And it was always great, you know, because you're sitting there at attention or standing there at attention, and he's going, I don't know what to do now. You can see it in his head. He says, well, go to the armorer as soon as we're through. But he did say, where's the bolt? And I said, it's an envelope in my wall locker. So, anyway, anecdote number one. Part of OCS was keeping your head about you, knowing a lot of this is not fluff, but it's trying to teach you something. So if you step back a little bit and appreciate the mechanics and the psychological aspects of the whole thing, parts of this were fairly amusing. Some weren't a lot of fun, but some of them were sort of, okay, you know, I guess we'll go do this. Flight training, once I got commissioned, basic school in Quantico for 6 months. Then from there, went to flight school. Two of my fraternity brothers who were grunts, ground folks, or aviators would call them earth people. Both of them went overseas to Vietnam right around Christmas of '67. A Harvard friend of mine and I were going to flight school, drove down to Pensacola. This was the '67, and I had a car with mass plates on it driving down near Montgomery, Alabama, and places like that going, we have to get out of Alabama, you know, with mass plates. So we timed it so we would go through Alabama to Pensacola, Florida, like 3 a.m. in the morning. As soon as we got to Florida, off came the mass plates, get Florida plates, you know, which didn't help too much because if you went over to Louisiana, like to New Orleans, Louisiana wasn't all that keen. They knew you were some out-of-stater, and then you had Florida plates. And I remember having a Louisiana state trooper tail me for 10 miles coming back from New Orleans, you know, through Mobile, and going, just drive the speed limit. Different world down there, I'll tell you. ROTC during the 70s, et cetera, fell out of favor. A lot of schools dropped it. They didn't like the war in Vietnam. You had a lot of anti-militarism in many respects. So ROTC was a reserve officer training corps, and typically you'd have a couple of classes that were required to be taken. Like I was in Navy ROTC, so you would have some naval-oriented classes like seamanship or something like that. The issue that was hot on campuses back then was that how can these people get credit for these, funky courses? Fine. And in the realms of academia, and it's probably more true today, in fact, on the liberalization or the bent of faculty, is that ROTC and those kind of courses just didn't cut it, especially in an Ivy League institution. So as a consequence, a lot of campuses, plus, dislike of the war. This is, back in the early 70s. A lot of colleges, Harvard, Dartmouth, a lot of colleges dropped ROTC courses. MIT, I think to its credit, kept ROTC going, and I know the Harvard students would go to MIT for their ROTC thing. If you were on a naval ROTC scholarship, at least that offered you a lifeline, to keep the scholarship. A lot of that was knee-jerk reaction in the 70s. 70s were a somewhat turbulent time, as were the late 60s, and what the academics viewed as right, wrong, or whatever, was driven a lot by, one, the turmoil of the time, and secondly, by the sort of an academic liberalism bent that this is really fluff, it's wrong, we shouldn't be supporting it. You see some of that still today, but campuses, I think, have become more liberal, certainly in the academic side, and one could argue that faculty has kind of usurped a lot of practical things within college and what it does, but they are a big voice and a big clout. So it'll change again. Kind of on that comment, with the rise of the all-volunteer force, things like that, there's been, I think, a big disconnect now between the civilian populace as a whole and what the military does. And I know the Marines, like Fallujah, stuff like that, the Marines are at war and America's at the mall. And I think that's led to, you end up with a lot of, what did Andrew Bacevich call it, lip service or easy grace, say thank you for your service, thank you for your service. And I think a lot of vets, you kind of got tired of hearing that because it's just saying it or whatever. That's why Bacevich calls it easy grace, simple way out. A lot of vets kind of react to, thank you, all you can do is nod and appreciate it, but it doesn't really mean much because there's this huge disconnect between, I think, the military and the civilian populace, which is why a friend of mine is a retired major general. We talk about how do you kind of meld society to being a cohesive part, as opposed to letting the 1% fight a war and the rest, as I said, go shopping at the mall. Bring back the draft, that was one idea. Having a compulsory national service, be another thing. But kind of the civics of society, I think, have been kind of, someone else will do it. And so there you are. Well, the problem with being a pilot is you have a lot of memories of some good, not so good, one of the prior speakers talked about going into bars, and he'd probably be looking for us, because John Lehman, who was Secretary of the Navy, back in the 60s and 70s, there was kind of a warrior culture, and especially among the aviation world. And you know, these guys like McCain were getting shot down, killed in aviation accidents in Vietnam. I probably knew 20 people had died just in training accidents, things like that. So you ended up with sort of a fatalistic view of life. And in doing that, you kind of had the attitude of live for today, which led to a lot of drinking, you know, probably today viewed as inappropriate behavior, all of which sort of culminated in the Taylor episode in '92, which I think was a huge overreaction, take it at least from my view, but to the events that happened at Taylor in '92, which ended up with this huge witch hunt, people losing jobs, commands, stuff like that over it. And I was sort of politically correctness driven, if that's the best way to put it. But John Lehman says, as a consequence, that a lot of the warrior ethic, which is sort of what you really want, the people that are going to go out and potentially die, whatever, you need that kind of attitude. Today it's gotten so scaled back that drinking clubs are all frowned upon. I know the Marines, I think the Navy, I'm not sure all the services, you know, actually started breathalyzer tests coming into work, you know, just to see if you were out the night before. So which way the pendulum swings, you know, the world is not a safe place, and you need to have some release somehow to keep that kind of ethos, you know, live for today, because we may die tomorrow, kind of thing. So how the pendulum swings, especially with this administration, who knows? But we'll find out.
What combat action did you witness?
Combat, I never dropped a bomb in anger. I flew F-4s on active duty, and I was supposed to go into Chulai in Vietnam, had my orders switched when I was in Okinawa, ended up in Iwakuni, which is in Japan, a Marine base, air station. The thing was, this was 1971, and people were starting to come out of Vietnam, and it was, for President Nixon at the time, it was a hot button to show that he was actually bringing people out of Vietnam. So I go to Iwakuni, which isn't what I wanted to do, even though I had orders into Vietnam. So I ended up signing on as an air liaison officer with a battalion of floats. It was back to Okinawa. Then getting on, there were 4 ships in our little flotilla, but we were a special reaction force. And we'd float off the coast of Vietnam, and then go to Hong Kong, and then come back. That's another long story. The military has a lot of humor, and the Navy captain who was in charge of this 4-ship thing had his wife, it was his sunset cruise, so-called, because he was retiring when it was all through. So he had flown his wife over, and she would situate in Taiwan, and then because we would go to Taiwan, and then she was in Hong Kong, and we'd go up to Hong Kong. And you can kind of watch this evolution, but I would sit in Da Nang Harbor, and I had a bunch of friends who were in Da Nang, and I was the air liaison officer, and I tried to schedule myself on a helicopter to go in, and I was told by the battalion CO, no, you cannot go. If the press catches one fresh face, they're going to, report that, and actually Nixon is reintroducing people into Vietnam and stuff like that while he was trying to spread the image of getting out of Vietnam. So my main thing was drinking a cup of coffee, I remember, on the flight deck of the helicopter carrier I was on, watching all the flares and everything else going off right in Da Nang Harbor, and I'm drinking a coffee and going, I mean, it was so surrealistic, just watching all the stuff going on. You could hardly hear it, and drinking a cup of coffee like it was like a movie. And then off we went to Hong Kong. So I was about to graduate from BU Law because I had gotten out in 72 to attend BU Law School. And ironically, a classmate, fraternity brother, was also a Marine, but he was a grunt and he was at Khe Sanh. And I get mail from these guys when I was in Pensacola waiting for flight training. And they arrive in envelopes, muddy with ripped up things, you know, but they'd be in little plastic envelopes. And another fraternity brother, who ultimately also went to BU Law later on, he managed to get these little dings. Yeah, I think he has like 2 Purple Hearts, but he had the tip of one finger shot off. And then, so you got a letter from him from the USS Repose where he was recovering, but he couldn't wait to go back. He'd be back at his next unit. Next thing you know, you get another letter from the USS Hope, and get another little ding, and then he'd go back. And then finally he said, you know, 2 Purple Hearts, you're back in the rear in Vietnam. But kind of my association with the war, especially with these 2 fraternity brothers who were around here and were, you know, good friends, is really kind of symbiotic, because I'm listening to the Khe Sanh stories that this one fella, you know, went through. And for a long time he wouldn't talk about it, and he's not now much more open about it. But Khe Sanh was a very messy thing in '68 during Tet, if you follow any history. But when the Tet offensive started in '68, these folks had just gotten overseas, beginning of '68 and to '67, and the whole world went boom. And my regret is, and I've said this to them, they were both grunts, and that all that time I was in flight school and getting this mail, and by the time I got overseas, everything had kind of ebbed the other way and people were leaving. And to this day, I always regret that I never, for all the training I did, never dropped a bomb in anger. Now, having said that, as I said, I was also stationed in Iwakuni in F4s, and we had, and the F4 was it was basically built as an interceptor to shoot down Russian bombers. And it's interesting, all the aerodynamics and how things work and everything. But we actually got the fleet, I think, was doing an exercise, and they were coming, for the first time, coming down the Sea of Japan. And of course the Russians were interested in all this exercise, so they were tailing the fleet. And our job was to provide air cover for the fleet coming down through the Sea of Japan. So I remember we took off from Iwakuni, which is on the east side of Japan, and the fleet's coming down the west side between, you know, Japan and Korea. So usually the fighters would go 2 airplanes. So we had real missiles and everything. Left Iwakuni, my wingman had a engine problem, so he went back, returned to base, so it was just me, a Marine captain with my backseater, and we go up over the Sea of Japan, and we're told to kind of park ourselves at 30,000 feet. And it was sort of broken clouds underneath, and I remember sort of as we're going around. The missiles were all tuned, thinking there's some Navy admiral down there who was scared out of his mind that this Marine captain is going to start World War III by deciding he's going to light off a missile at one of the Russian aircraft that were kind of tagging the fleet. So he had me parked, probably 200 miles away from the fleet just for doing this. And I'm going, ha ha ha. And all we did was big arcs around waiting, and then finally went home again. But anyway, there's my war story. How do we get society more integrated as viewing itself as a society, civically, as a group? I go back to my, Marines are at war, America's at the mall. And I don't know what the good solution is in that. I do think that probably some sort of service of some sort. Quite frankly, when I was in high school here, I thought I should take a year off. And I investigated going through the Merchant Marine. And then got an early decision, so I said, okay, then I'm headed off to college. And I thought about, as I said, what do I want to do after I graduate? And bumped into this Navy ROTC fella, and then said, okay, that seems like something to do. But somehow it's doing something, I think, as a part of society, whether it's National Service, Peace Corps. I mean, there are lots of opportunities, volunteer stuff, but to kind of be part of the fabric of the society. Society today is getting so fragmented that I don't think people appreciate that really we're all in this together one way or the other. And unless you get out and participate and view things like that, like I'm in the Salvation Army Board, a lot of Marine Corps scholarship stuff. It's kind of giving back, but also participating. And that's sort of my message, is to participate one way or the other, but get out there and do something.